Hello, everybody, and greetings from the McGill School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. You're attending an event called Speaking Up, an exploration of developmental language disorder, a hidden disorder with a big impact. My name is Martha Crago. Right now, I am the Vice Principal Research and Innovation at McGill, but for many years, I was associated with the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill and a professor there who studied children's language development and disorders of that development. So it's a great pleasure for me to be involved and to frankly update myself from the wonderful work that the panelists that we have with us today have been doing over the last few years. And so I'm eager to get started and hear from them. We're eager to have your questions, and we'll pause at different points to encourage you to submit any questions in case you haven't yet. And then after hearing some various questions we had developed, we'll come back to your questions. So I'm going to begin by introducing these panelists one at a time as I ask them a question. So the first one is Elin Thordardottir. And Elin is a professor in the McGill School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. She's a certified speech and language pathologist, and her research takes a cross-linguistic look at typical language development and at children who have developmental language disorders. She's been involved in some very large-scale studies, including one that we'll hear about again when I introduce Jim, which is cost action, enhancing children's oral language skills across Europe and beyond. And this has been a collaboration focusing on interventions for children learning their first language. Her current research is on young immigrants in Montreal and the long-term attainment of bilingual adolescents. So with that, Elin, I thought I'd begin with this question for you. How aware do you think the public is of what we're calling DLD, developmental language disorder? And what do you think they think it is?
Well, as it turns out, we have just done a study on this. For a long time, it has been suspected that the public is much less aware of DLD than of some other conditions that are such as autism that are less prevalent than DLD. And that could be because DLD may be a bit harder to understand. Because what it is most simply is that children have lower language skills than would be expected for their age in their own language, and that they have difficulties that come from that. But one of the hard things about understanding that is that the manifestation may not always look like what you would think a disorder looks like. It's not always errors. It may be correct language, but simply more simple than expected. So people who are not professionals in this may not pick up on that and may think that the problem has another cause, such as a reading disorder or language learning disability, etc., when in many cases underlying that is language. And another reason why people are not aware of DLD is because it has gone by a number of different names. And that is because researchers have been researching different aspects of it. So they've called it specific language impairment, primary language, primary language impairment, language learning disorder, etc. So recently, there was a group of researchers referred to as a catalyzed consortium that came together and to just try to agree on one name to help the public and practitioners be able to focus on the fact that various types of language impairments, they are basically the same thing. So now we have this new term, developmental language disorder. So within the cost action that you just mentioned, Martha, on which was called Cost Action IS 1406, and which was led by James Law and myself, one of the working groups did an international study looking at the awareness of DLD. So we did the study in 18 countries of Europe. And what we found out is that across the countries, awareness of DLD was about 60% of people on average, going in some countries down to 13%. Meanwhile, in all of the countries, awareness of autism was reliably 90% or above. And that is food for thought because DLD is about 20 times more prevalent. So this study is about to be published in the Journal of Communication Disorders. What we found also is that there are differences in what people think the nature of this is. People were more likely to know about things such as that are obvious, such as low vocabulary or low syntactic or grammatical skills, but less likely to know about more subtle things like not understanding jokes, not being invited to birthday parties. But interestingly, having low self-esteem came up pretty high, so people were aware of that one. Another thing that I'd like to say about this study is that the Catalyze Consortium, even though it was an international group of people, it was only done in English-speaking countries. So the UK, US, Canada, Australia, Ireland, but it did not include other languages. Whereas this study that we did and that cost action focuses on a very large number of other languages, and that brings in a whole other level of complexity. So we found in general in other studies in our cost action that there are different traditions in service delivery, there are different traditions in how language disorders are conceptualized, but there are also differences in what they're actually called at the present time. So in order to replace that with a term like developmental language disorder, that means that we need to translate that term. And that is a hard thing. Developmental doesn't exist as an adjective in all languages. In some languages, development is confounded with evolution. So simply just translating the term because it needs to be clear that it is an equivalent to the English term, because people will turn to the internet in English. And so in order to really raise awareness in different countries, those are issues that have to be dealt with, and we don't always think about that because we publish international studies in English-speaking journals, and we sort of come to think that the English standard is the internationally agreed upon standard, which it is and always. We found out also that where people had heard of autism was in the media. So I think that going forward, what we will need to do is talk more about DLD in the media, make people more aware.
Okay, so let me press on here and see when we get to the end of the first three speakers, if we've covered some of the questions that people have written in. So it's a pleasure to introduce James Law to you. He's a professor of speech and language science at Newcastle University in the UK. And he's had research grant funding of large quantity and published many, many articles on the topics that we're discussing today. He is lead on something called the UK's Better Communication Research Program, the Australian Centre for Research Excellence in Child Language, and he, as Elin has said, was chair of this COST IS 1406 project. And he's now running a very interesting program called Social Inequality and Its Effects on Child Development, a study of birth cohorts in the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. So this is a person who's had a lot of experience working on and running big projects. And he became an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2018 and was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Association of Logopedics and Phoniatrics in 2019. So James, the question I thought you might help us with are, what are the long-term outcomes for children with DLD?
Thank you, Martha. So this is probably the biggest question for me and many other researchers too, because you want to know what's going to happen when you see a child of 4, 5, that sort of age, but what sort of concern you have over a period of time. And it's also the question that parents are very interested in, because they want to know, well, my child is having difficulty relative to other children. So what does it mean in the longer term? So there have been a number of studies where you're looking at change over time for a few years, so 2 or 3 years. There's lots of studies like that, and you can see quite a lot of consistency. So language tends to remain a problem. In the early years, you get a lot of problems with literacy, and you also get problems with behavior. There's some question about whether conduct is more relevant or emotional difficulties, but it clearly has an impact on school achievement. And now there have been a number of studies where they've followed children up from the school entry sort of period, 5, 6, that sort of age, through into adolescence. And there's plenty of evidence that these children do quite badly at school. Not all of them, of course, and some of them do fine and they go on to college, that sort of thing. But a lot of them are at risk for struggling throughout the school system. Now, what I wanted to go on and talk about really was what happens when they're in their 20s and 30s. And of course, these studies are much more difficult to get hold of because it takes a lot of energy to follow children through all that period. And there have been now about 3 or 4, of which one of the biggest actually is from Canada, from the Ottawa Carleton region. The psychiatrist Beichman has been responsible for these, and so many of you will know these studies, I suspect, and they've carried on reporting through to when the children are in their 30s, effectively. And what you see is there's a number of things. So the first thing is the emotional and behavioural factor remains in the mix all the way through. So children with low language difficulties early on often have difficulties with engaging and communication with people later on. And the most recent study by Lin Bao, so that's from the Ottawa Carleton report, talked about social anxiety as being one of the main keys. Now, the other bit that I'm interested in is what happens to literacy. And we've done some work following up the big birth cohorts in Britain, where you're looking at 11, 12,000 children, and you see a marked effect of literacy. So if you look at 5-year-olds who've got low language skills, you can detect literacy difficulties later on. And I guess the third thing I wanted to highlight, which is, again, fewer studies look at this than the other areas, but is the issue about employment. Because in our very heavily white-collar world that we live in the developed world, communication skills are probably the #1 thing that employers are looking for. And what you see is that a lot of the children in these follow-up studies, not children, of course, they're adults, when you have to do this after they get to the age of about 25, 26, because before that, it's a bit difficult to tell what their employment is going to be. But what you find is there is a tendency for children whose parents are well educated and in the middle classes, for example, to be taking jobs which aren't in those sorts of class jobs. And the other thing is that the level of unemployment, certainly from our studies, the level of unemployment for people with low communication skills is quite a lot higher. Now, of course, those studies were, that study I'm referring to were of children born in the 70s. So this is when they were in the 1980s and 1990s. The situation about employment is slightly different now, and unemployment isn't as low as it was in the 80s. So it's very contextually dependent. But it's still pretty clear that communication skills are the #1 thing that employers are looking for, and people without good employment and good communication skills are likely to be vulnerable in the longer term. I think there's probably enough on that. There's quite a lot more I could talk about, but I think that's the main message. Thank you, Martha.
Okay, and now we're going to turn to Sue, and I have picked up a question along the way that I will feed into Elin, who is going to discuss things about bilingualism and multilingualism in a minute. But Sue, Sue Roulstone is a professor emeritus at the University of West England, Bristol, and a member of the Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit. She's also been the chair of the board for the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and is still a very active person in this. And she's been a manager of speech and language therapy services, as well as a lecturer in courses on this topic. So Sue, I thought I could ask you, what are the perceptions of parents and children themselves about this disorder? What's the lived experience of it?
Thank you, Martha. Hello, everybody. Well, we've been, over the number of years, we've been carrying out a number of qualitative studies with parents and children, interviewing them, running focus groups, and carrying out workshops to understand their perspectives. And it's a team who are all based at in various times over time at the Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit. Looking at it from the parents' perspective, I think their perspective changes over time. In the early days, when the children are just beginning to reach that stage when one would expect them to start talking, then that's a time of uncertainty and great puzzlement, and sometimes also fear and anxiety for parents, I think, at that time. Parents talk about their lack of knowledge as they approach that time. And for most parents, the whole process of learning to talk is a bit of a mystery, and children learn almost magically. They accumulate this great wealth of knowledge and language without any apparent effort on the part of the parents. So when parents have a child who doesn't do that, it's a great puzzle. It's a great worry to them, and parents start to feel guilty about that. They ask, have I done something wrong? What is it? What's going on here? So it's a great, the lack of knowledge about that is something that bothers them. I think also parents' experiences that they're getting huge mixed messages from both professionals and from other members of the public, their family, their grandparents, everything from the apocryphal story about Einstein, that Einstein didn't talk till he was 4, and look at Einstein, he was all right. So there's that idea that children grow out of these early problems, through to people pushing them to seek help early. So they get very mixed messages, and they also have very mixed feelings themselves about it. Some parents report feeling fear about the worst case scenario, so they're dreaming up what are the possible diagnoses here, what could be the problem, through to their own wish to see their child develop without intervention. So they don't want a 2-year-old to be medicalised. They don't want that early label attached to their child. They're concerned about that. They're also dealing with questions and comments from their family and friends. What's going on with your child? Why isn't your child talking? So they're having to respond to these comments in a place of lack of knowledge for themselves. So those experiences are hugely variable and quite a lot of uncertainty in those early stages. Once their child has reached a stage where they have some kind of diagnosis, I think the pattern then seems to change, and parents talk about the battle and the fight. Those are words that parents use a lot of the time about their struggle to access services and to have understanding from people, both in the public and professionals, about the nature of their child's disorder. So it is, they have to become an advocate for their child, somebody who is speaking on their child's behalf. So they're challenged, why isn't your child talking yet? So they have to explain that to people. The public don't understand, so they're in a position where they're having to make explanations for their children. I think also during that time, parents understand how much rests on their child's communication. Parents talk about communication as being critical and crucial, key. Those are the sorts of words they use to the rest of their child's life. They know that, and they understand how much it impacts on the child's social participation, their inclusion, being able to make friends, that sort of thing. Their future independence depends on being able to communicate. They see that, and they naturally feel uncertain about it. If I can just, have I got time to go on to the children's perspectives, and have a sense of the similar sort of thing. We've done workshops with children where we get them to describe what a good day is like, what a bad day is like, who supports them, who helps them. And what's become clear is what a colleague of mine, Helen Hambley, has described as that the impact of DLD on children's life is situational. It varies according to who they talk to. So their experience of DLD is contextual. So to give you an example, Helen Hambley describes a young girl called Sarah. Sarah's teacher says Sarah doesn't make any friends because she lacks empathy and she is domineering with her friends. Sarah's sister says that Sarah doesn't have friends because Sarah's very exciting to be with, and her friends aren't very exciting. The other children in her class are not very exciting. So the perception of how Sarah is behaving and the impact of her DLD is hugely contextual. So Sarah's experience will vary from somebody who is seeing her negatively and somebody who sees her as an exciting companion. So children's experiences therefore vary. They talk very positively about themselves, like we do. We all take up positive positions about our own identity, and children with DLD do that too. They see themselves as competent, as socially attractive, as kind, as good, but they also recognize the other and more what they regard as undesirable labels that are attached to them, and they report that they're teased and they're bullied on that account. So I think the other part of the children's experience is being understood and being misunderstood and misunderstanding. So I think they spend quite a lot of their lives not quite understanding what is going on around them, not being able to decode what other people are saying, and also being seems to be a human approach to being not understood. People say it louder, and also I suspect my internet's gone a bit weird, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay. So why don't I interrupt right now with a couple of questions that have come in, and as I was listening to the first presentations, I began thinking, I bet you a couple of people are going to want to know this, and sure enough, these questions showed up. So one person has asked us, as a parent of young children, is there a good reference that she can refer to for language milestones in children 2 to 5 years of age? How does she get a feeling of whether a child might have DLD? And then another one says, what are the earliest signs of DLD? Could you assume that a child has it as young as, let's say, 18 months? So how are parents going to figure out that they're starting to work in this sphere with a child who has DLD? Yeah, Jane.
So I think you want a reference to a text, right? So there are masses of these things. The internet is covered in milestone information. The one that we get our students to look at is one by a pediatrician called Mary Sheridan, who did this work on milestones about 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, these things don't change very much, so if it's old, it probably doesn't matter too much. So, but there's lots of this information around. Sorry.
Yes.
I was going to refer to a couple of a website in particular that has been designed for parents by one of the parent organisations in the UK called Aphasic, and they've joined forces with the Royal College and another organisation called ICANN and the Communication Trust, and they've created a website called Talking Point. And that's a good source of information about developmental milestones and how to recognise when your child is not reaching those milestones and when there are risk signs.
If I may just add, Martha, to this, just to add that the milestones of development are not the same in all languages. So, for example, English is a language with very low inflectional, complexity. The development of French will be different. The development of Icelandic will be different. So if you're looking for, in general, children will add to their vocabularies as they grow. They will make longer and longer sentences, but as to what exact kinds of structures they're using, that will be different in different languages. And I think that for some languages, nothing has been published. For some languages, it has been. I would think that for people, that a good source of information is to contact a clinic or contact the Order of Speech Pathologists to see whether they can refer them to materials on that if it's a non-English source that they need.
But we could share our links, I guess, if that would be useful for this group. You know,
We can share some things with you after by sending information to the people who registered for this session.
Can I pick up the point about the 18-month bit or the young
Yes.
children?
So what can we expect to know something when a child's as young as 18?
Well, so the answer is you have to be very careful with pathologizing. This is the word that Sue used for saying that children have got problems because they are different in some ways when they're very young. I mean, it's true later on, but it's particularly true when they're young. And there's a lot of movement in children's development in the first 2 or 3 years of life. And it's very difficult to be absolutely clear that you've got a child who's got a problem which you need to do something about. So each country deals with this differently, but most countries in the developed world have developmental checks that are carried out by, we call them health visitors, but child health nurses, these sorts of people, and they help try to engage with parents and talk to them about their child and where they've got to. So there are some children where it's really obvious that something needs to be done, you know, if they've got cerebral palsy or they're deaf or something like that. And the ones who've got language problems but nothing else, it's a judgment about whether you think something needs to be worked on. And hopefully speech and language pathologists are working quite closely with their child health nurses to try and inform them, to show them what they're actually looking for. But you wouldn't want to take every child who had a slightly low language score at the age of 18 months and say they've got a developmental language disorder. I mean, it emerges over a period of time, and when you're looking at 18-month 2-year-olds, you're looking at indicators which then follow up. You work with the parents at a sort of public health level, and then gradually, if they still have difficulties later on, they get referred on to the speech and language pathologists and the more specialist people in the workforce.
Okay, we're going to move on, but I am going to add in here from my own experience with my 3 children. One of them was speaking in 3-word combinations at 15 months. Another one didn't say a single word until after 2 years, and he's an extremely literate verbal person. So this is, and the third one was somewhere in between. So there's a lot of variation in the early years, and 18 months is young still, from my perspective. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a question now about bilingual and multilingualism. But Elin, let me tell you that a few people have been asking questions related to this. So maybe you can deal with them as you talk about the question I'm going to ask you. We have one parent wanting to know, what are the earliest signs of DLD? And another one that says, how do you detect it? So that one we've covered, but then how do you detect DLD in multilingual children or in children that neither speak English or French? And then other people with concerned about, do you think that allophone or Anglophone students benefit from attending a school in English if they have DLD? And it may have been that was allophone or Francophone students. Should they be in a second language schooling environment? So maybe you can cover the schooling part of it and the early detection part. When I ask you this, is there an association between bilingualism, multilingualism, and DLD?
Well, there is, if I just answer that last question first, there is a very strong consensus in the profession that DLD is not caused by bilingualism. So people who have or living in a situation of multilingualism do not have to be afraid that the bilingualism or multilingualism caused the DLD. If their child has DLD, they do not need to remove one of the languages, especially the home language, because there's a very big it's important for people, especially if they feel it's important themselves, to maintain their own native language, you know, for in an immigrant situation. So it does not help to remove that language. It helps to keep it. It helps the children then if they have a strong foundation in the language of their home, it will help them learn whatever other languages they have to learn later to live in their communities. Now, I'm trying to think what were the other questions. Well, how do you detect language impairment in bilingual children? That is, as far as diagnostic decisions go, that can be one of the most difficult ones. Bilingual children learn each of their languages in proportion to how much time they spend in that language. Also, you know, the amount of exposure they have to them, also the quality. So how much people talk to them, how much practice they get. So they tend to have, they can have very unequal proficiencies in each of their two languages. And so what the speech pathologist has to do is often they are able to formally assess only one of the languages. Sometimes they cannot assess either one of them because they don't know them. So they are limited by their own language knowledge and by what tools they have. So sometimes they are assessing the stronger language of the child. Sometimes they're assessing the weaker language of the child. And what they need to do is they need to very carefully look at what kinds of experiences the child has had so that they can try to estimate with that amount of experience, how far could we have expected the child to get in that language? And does that look like it is a language impairment? Children cannot have a language impairment only in one language. If they have within normal range skills in at least one of their languages, they do not have language impairment. But this can be very hard to estimate, especially if you can't measure both languages. Then you have to rely on parent report. You have to rely on observations of other people of the kinds of difficulties that the child is experiencing. And I think that that's also something that is worth mentioning, because it is food for thought that it can be very difficult to disentangle DLD and early stages of bilingualism. When children are starting to learn a second language, they can look like they have DLD because their language knowledge is distributed over two or more languages. And I think it is something that we need to give thought to, that those are so strikingly similar, because at that point in time, bilingual children may be going through difficulties in communication that are similar to DLD. I had that kind of experience myself, being a bilingual child, of being in school and not understanding anything, feeling out of place, not being, having nobody want to talk to me. So that may be a stage that is more temporary for young bilinguals, but it is a stage that they go through. So I think that we need to think about, if we go to the question of should children be in bilingual schooling, if they are, should they go to school in English or French if they are from immigrant homes? For some people, this is a choice. If they're in Canada and they speak French or English, they can choose. For immigrants, it is not a choice. They just simply have to. And I think that what the research shows is that bilingualism is an asset. It's an opportunity. It's something that helps people out. And children with DLD should have the same right to that. But I think it's very clear that they need more support. It does take, because if you have DLD, you can learn two languages, but you will get there more slowly for two reasons. One of them being DLD, the other one being because you're dividing your time between two languages. And that's perfectly doable, but it's not the case that it's simple. It is not the case that it isn't fraught with some difficulties at times. So I think we as a society, as the school system, as a healthcare system, we need to give that a lot of attention and make sure that these kids get the support they need so that their parents do not decide to abandon that situation.
Okay, I'm gonna wing in here with a question that maybe James can help us with. We've got a couple of questions that have to do with terminology. So we've got a recent one that says, what are the diagnostic criteria for DLD? Is this a new term for apraxia of speech? We have another question, so that raises the apraxia of speech, that says, can you give the latest research on congenital aphasia of speech and any associated motor abnormalities? So both of these, in my knowledge of them, have to do more with motor things. Yeah. So maybe you can help us sort out what are we talking about with DLD? What are we talking about with something called apraxia? And another question that has put congenital aphasia of speech.
Yeah, okay. So the terminology, as we've already said, has changed a lot over the last half century. And the term aphasia came out of the adult aphasia studies in the 30s and 40s, and then got translated into developmental child conditions in the 50s and 60s. But by the time of the sort of early 80s, it had sort of moved out. People don't use it now in English, but as Elin pointed out to us earlier on, it is used in Francophone countries. And with our cost action, it was obvious that there's a very wide range of things that are used. Developmental language disorder is just the consensus term that is being used for language problems which have a dramatic or a marked effect on a child's performance. In an earlier iteration, they used the term, as we heard before, specific language impairment, and that technically meant that the child had to have a non-verbal IQ within normal limits. Now that isn't really the case now, and in developmental language disorders, it's quite common for children not to have not very well developed non-verbal skills as well. So I'm not going to go through the definition of DLD. I could do, but it takes a bit of time, right? But the question about apraxia, which is Martha's point, apraxia is different. So conventionally, children with developmental language disorders would not be apraxic. Apraxia is considered to be a motor speech problem, which is primarily relates to speech. The confusion sometimes comes if their speech is so bad, it sounds that their language is bad or poorly formed as well, because they knock the ends off words and things like that. But primarily, childhood apraxia of speech, as it's called in North America, or dyspraxia, as it tends to be called in the UK, is a motor speech problem, which means that the children have difficulty formulating sounds. I don't know any of my colleagues want to add anything to that. But in the case of the interventions for apraxia, there are a lot of single cases, and they've been reviewed in the last few years, and that's quite easy to get that sort of information. There is a Cochrane review of childhood apraxia of speech interventions, and they only found one group study, which was a randomized control study. So what that tells you is that it's difficult to find enough children to put in apraxia studies because it's a very rare condition. So it's much less well developed than it is in some of the developmental language disorder interventions, which maybe we'll mention later on.
Right, so different than DLD.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna go back, Elin, because I'm not sure with the questions that came in that you covered things like in which language bilingual children get therapy, and also the question about allophone or francophone children, if they have DLD, should they be in an English school?
Yeah, so if I talk about the interventions that children get, it is considered, or the general recommendation is that children should get intervention in their own native language or in the stronger language. In reality, they usually get intervention in the language of the community where they live, because most of the speech pathologists will know that language. For a long time, we thought this was a very bad thing because it was sort of felt that children had to learn their second language through their first language. But what we have now is we have a number of large-scale intervention studies that show that if you give children intervention in their second language, even if it is their weaker language, they do make progress in that language. So what that tells us is that the services that we're currently able to give to most children, they're not ideal. It would be better if we could work on both languages, but at least they do provide progress in that language, so they're not wasted. It would be even better if we could find ways to work on both languages. Sometimes we can get that through a collaboration with the parents, such that they do something at home or something like that. to that, and I think that going forward, we've taught in research on intervention for bilingual children. We've been talking so much about which language. I think with time we will go more, and we're starting to do that, to go more into more refined, for individual children, what do they need to know in each language? What do they do with each of their languages? If they go to school in one language, they don't have exactly the same needs for communication in each of their languages. Now, to the Quebec situation of whether allophone children, so allophones are children who speak neither English nor French at home, so they are tend to be children of immigrants. Should they? So by law in Quebec, they have to go to school in French because the official language is French. And in that situation, there's not a lot of talk about that. It's interesting, that allophones, like my own children are a part of that group, they just have to go to school in French, whether they have DLD or not. They have to be bilingual. Nobody asks any questions about that. That's just life for them. Whereas for the French English, you get to ask the question. But if they're allophone and then they go to school in English, there's a possible situation of trilingualism. And the question in that is, if you introduce trilingualism to a child, that's in some cases that's just life, and that's what you have to do. And in some cases it's a choice, and I am not sure that would be necessarily a good choice. And you also have to remember, or maybe there's a bit of a misconception among people, that you have to learn early. If you have to learn multilingualism early, you retain, if you have a good base in some language, you can always learn another language later on. You don't have to feel like you're missing out and that it all has to happen all at once. So if I tell you about research that I do a lot of research in Quebec where you have two languages that are equally strong, so French and English. I also do a lot of research in Iceland, which is my native country, where we have Icelandic, a national language that is itself not extremely strong because there is so much English available to kids, even in media. So children, before they ever have an English class in school, they're conversational in English. So they develop conversational skills from incidental exposure, but that knowledge doesn't necessarily ever go very far because, there's only so much you can get from computer games and Netflix. But what you get in that situation is you get children, the immigrant children are exposed to 3 languages rather than 2, and they spend their time about equally in 3 languages. And what that does is that it gives them conversational skills in all 3 languages, but for many of them, they reach adolescence and they don't have very strong skills in any language. So my advice would be, after, so it says that not all language environments are equal for developing multilingualism, and I would say, especially if children are having a difficulty with language, if you don't have to have 3 languages, maybe that's not a great idea. If you have to have them, and it's part of life, I think it is, or I've come to think that, I've changed my mind on this a bit through doing research. I think it's very important to make sure that children have one very strong language, that there is one language that gets at least about half of their time. And there's some research to show that then it's okay if you speak more than 1 language in the rest of your time. So that would be, I think, according to current research, that's what I would say.
Okay, so we're going to move on here now to a set of questions about intervention. But as I put them out to Sue and then to James and Elin, if they want to come in on them, there are a couple of questions coming in over the chat that I received. Concerned with adolescents and what kind of intervention is there for adolescents, or one mother of a 19-year-old with DLD, how does she continue to provide support for a 19-year-old? And then a third question about special classes. Should children with DLD be in special classes? So as we talk about intervention, maybe we can deal with this older adolescent question and the special classes wound into the information that we have when I ask Sue this question. So Sue, aims of intervention.
Martha, I missed your first question. I got the adolescents
Okay,
interventions.
both questions around adolescents. What kind of support can there be for adolescents, including a 19-year-old, where they usually fall out of any of the educational services provided? So what can a home support plan look like? And then this question about special classes. Would it be better if we put children with DLD into special classes?
Okay. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about the latter one. I'll leave somebody else, I think, to talk about adolescents, because it's not, I'm not up to date with what one would offer. I know that services in the UK are fairly few and far between for adolescents, so it's an issue in terms of service development, although it is growing in the UK, and one of my colleagues can perhaps give some more information on that. In terms of special classes, the research is not very conclusive one way or the other in terms of in the UK, in terms of whether children benefit. It's hard to evaluate exactly. You can't have a trial of randomly assigning children to either a special class or to a mainstream class. And the decisions whether to place children in that has in the past been largely ideological, that the move towards inclusive education has meant that a lot of the special classes have disappeared, whereas in other countries I know that special classes are very much more supported and still seem to be the way forward. I think in terms of the evidence, and it isn't very strong to support that one way or another, but I think some children benefit from the smaller classes and the companionship and the success that they get in a smaller class with peers who have similar problems, whereas others benefit from being socially with their local peers. So I'll leave others to come in on that. I think in terms of general aims of intervention, then if we're thinking about language with younger children, and most of therapists take a more socially constructivist view, then it's about setting up the environment to help children acquire language. So we assume, the assumption is that children haven't been able to benefit from the humdrum and the noisy language environment in which they currently exist, and so we have to structure that in a way that they're able to acquire the vocabulary and the grammatical and semantic structures that they need to. So much of the early intervention is about working with parents to help them do exactly that. So for example, if you're wanting children to learn particular vocabulary or particular semantic relationships, then you would set up and structure their everyday play or their everyday activities in a way that provides lots of repetition of a particular set of vocabulary perhaps, or that provides a good amount of feedback and expansion to their interventions. So that it is very much about working collaboratively with families in order to support families to deliver those interventions.
Okay,
I'll leave
good.
it there for James to come, or Elin to come in.
Yeah, Elin or James, do you have things you want to add about intervention? Being able to, say, change the performance of children with DLD?
So I can comment on the amount, right? Because that's often a question is, well, how much does it affect you? What we've done is we've carried out a systematic review of the literature, the intervention literature, and you start making the studies all comparable, so that they'll measure them all. They look at effect sizes, which often aren't reported by the people who've carried out the studies, but you can take them out of their data, and then you can compare the different outcomes of the study. So Sue is talking about the content, so what people are doing and what they're aiming to do, but in the end, how they establish what they've done is through the outcome they've used with the children, or possibly with the parents. But essentially, what you measure tells you what you were trying to do. And it is possible now because there's been, I don't know, 60 or 70 studies, trials, randomized trials of this sort of work. So you're beginning to get a sense of where the strengths of the interventions lie. So using here a criteria which is used by in the UK, we have something called the Education Endowment Foundation, and sponsor, they fund trials, all sorts of things to do with schools. So using their criteria and applying them to the studies that speech and language pathologists do with children with DLD, you would say that there's a group of studies which have very sort of low effects, and go working that way around, which means that you get 1 or 2 months benefit within a year for these sorts of interventions. And for those so far, from the interventions we've got, this receptive syntax, so it's understanding of syntax, would come into that category, as would pragmatic language abilities. These are social, interactive communication skills, which are often seen in children with autistic difficulties, but increasingly looked at with children with DLD, because it seems to be a feature of quite a lot of children with DLD, and it's quite difficult to shift them. That's what that's telling you. People often make assumptions about it, but it's difficult to demonstrate that you can shift them anyway. So in terms of the ones with moderate effects, there are now moderate effects you can see for children for therapists teaching narrative skills to children. That is, the children's ability to retell stories. This is a really critical feature of their educational experience. They need to be able to do this storytelling in the classroom, and it's very good from the point of view of representing what they're doing. So that gives you 3 to 5 months advantage over a year. So that's not too bad. But there's a number of areas where we've now demonstrated there are really quite high effects of intervention. This means consistently high based on the interventions that have been reported. This doesn't necessarily mean what people do in practice, it just means these interventions are available and people have talked about them. So for a high level of effect, you'd expect 6 to 8 months change over a course of a year. So that means they go up by a year because they're developmentally changed by a year. But in addition, they gain an extra 6 to 8 months advantage. And for those ones, we have expressive vocabulary. So people are good at doing that sort of work. Expressive phonology, that's speech work. Speech therapists are very experienced with this and get consistent results. Expressive syntax, so that's the ability to teach children grammar, which is an interesting one because people have made some strong claims about grammar being a genetically determined thing that you might expect might be quite resistant to treatment. Nonetheless, that seems to have worked. And the one with the highest results is receptive vocabulary. So that is the children's understanding of words. And of course, this underpins a lot of interventions. And I think it's very important to stress that the results for these last few are really quite pronounced. And we did this review 20 years ago nearly when we started doing it. And we've updated it recently. And it's quite interesting that the results are getting sort of narrower and narrower. They're more and more consistent in some areas, and particularly with receptive vocabulary. So I think there's some very strong positive messages about the interventions that can be carried out with these children. And we've got good numerical evidence. In the end, the qualitative stuff is very important, but the numerical evidence is what feeds into how people make judgments about services. Just getting back to the point that Sue made about adolescents, right? Just picking up on that issue. Yeah, in the UK, it's very difficult because there's very few services for children with adolescents. There are quite a lot of people doing work on narrative skills and this sort of thing with younger adolescents, far less with older adolescents. So once they've left compulsory schooling, we do have people in sort of adult education, but it's very sporadic as to whether they get support. My sense is that children who are autistic or who have learning difficulties are often more likely to get support in that context than children who've got DLD, because DLD is not widely recognized and therefore it doesn't have budgets associated with it. And I'm afraid in a very bleak political world, that often is what determines whether extra things are provided for children. That's enough from me, I think. Back to you, Martha.
Okay. We have about 7 minutes left. So I do think we have to cover two things. One is, how much is DLD associated with other common conditions of childhood, James? And the other one is, and any one of you can answer this, the earliest age that a child could be diagnosed as having DLD as opposed to language difficulties.
Shall I pick up the first one?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so if you look at any neurodevelopmental condition or sensory difficulty in childhood, it is often associated or has associated language problems. So you get a child with autism, you get a child with learning difficulties, if you get a child with hearing loss, if you get a child with ADHD, these sorts of conditions, you commonly see that language is a feature of what they find difficult. It's not the only thing, of course it isn't, but it's part of the profile. So what I think the point I'm making is that it is closely associated with lots of other conditions in childhood. If you then take a group of children with DLD, so which means that they primarily have problems with language, and they don't diagnostically have problems with other areas. So you're picking up primarily because they have DLD. And then you start doing detailed assessments with these children. You often find that, for example, that they have fine motor problems, or that they may have gross motor problems too. You often find that they may have history of hearing losses, for example. And the other thing which is most common probably, and the term often is used, is comorbidity, is that they have behavior difficulties. So, and it's not surprising if you think about it. If a child can't communicate very effectively, it's not surprising that they have difficulty interacting with their peers and with their teachers. And teachers often aren't very aware of the needs of children with DLD. And so, for example, if a child doesn't respond because they simply haven't understood the question in the first place, the teacher may rephrase the question in an equally complex way. And the child is left there trying to process the initial request and then is asked another request, which just adds to their confusion. And so what these children often look like, they're not managing very well in class, and often they're perceived by teachers to be difficult. And we need a greater understanding by the teaching staff of the needs of these children to prevent that happening, so that we understand that language often underpins their difficulties. So the last thing I want to say about this, and it's not really about conditions that are associated, underneath these, for the DLD children, you have to pay attention to the level of the sort of social disadvantage associated with it. So if you look at across the whole population, and we have done in some of our big studies, you get much higher levels of these low language skills in more socially disadvantaged populations. So we need to be very careful. And then of course you also get the behavior difficulties in those populations too. So you need to be careful that you're actually looking at the right thing. And we can often just focus on one thing because we're experienced in this particular way. We need to look at the whole child, and I think that's a really important feature of looking at any children, of course, but particularly with children with DLD, we need to look at the whole picture. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our time here. So I hope for everybody that you have been able to learn some things in this wonderful panel discussion. We're fortunate to have these three people with us. What we will do is we will gather a few references that we can send out to those who registered for this conference. And thank you very, very much for your questions. Certainly this older adolescent group is a group that is always very difficult for everybody because you fall out of the educational support systems and you change, as one parent has pointed out in a question, from a pediatrician to another kind of doctor who may have less awareness of developmental disorders. So lots of things that still need research, still need a lot of attention in our health and educational systems. And thank you everybody for attending. And thank you to our three panelists for presenting interesting information from research, from your clinical experiences, and from things come at from the different perspectives of different countries. It's wonderful, been a wonderful mix of information here. Okay, so thank you all. We'll be logging off, but we will try to send out some reference materials to you, to everybody who registered for this event. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and we're happy to have you with us at McGill.
Bye-bye.